There we go. Great. Well, happy Friday, everyone. So excited to have Kira here. I was just saying, Kira and I met about 6 years ago and just hit it off right away. An amazing human and a great clinician with a ton of experience working with women and men and couples through the perinatal season. And so I'm just going to hand it right off to you, Kira. You're in Portland
I'm in
in
Portland.
your cute 1920s bungalow.
Yeah.
She's very handy. She's like retiles her bathroom. She's like, very. But yeah, so lucky to have Kira's expertise here. And then I think you can tell us kind of how you're structuring our time. We have 90 minutes today. And this does count for CEUs. So make sure at the end of the training, we will follow up with the video recording. And then there will be a link in there for the form to fill out, as always, for Alyssa to send you your certificate for CEUs. So, and hi, Kathy. Kathy on our team actually has a new baby.
Oh, okay. So all of this, you will know all about this. None of this will be news to you. Um, okay, well, so I think if you read the little description that was part of this training stuff, you may have seen that I self-identify as having experience in this work for about the last 10 years, and that I extend all the way back to when I started working as a nanny for a family that had newborn twins, and I worked with them till those twins were about 5 years old, which is the most firsthand experience of this stuff that you can get. I mean, second to doing it yourself as a parent, obviously. And then I did an internship at the Center for Perinatal Bonding and Support, which I will be mentioning at different points throughout our time today. And then I've been doing this work as a therapist for, I guess it's been almost 6 years, right? Five to 6 years, because I've basically started out doing it and never really wanted to stop. And probably wouldn't have been allowed to stop even if I wanted to, because all the referrals just kept coming in. So when people find that you do this work, especially like doctors and other healthcare providers in the perinatal world, they will send people to you. They really want to know who's doing this and who's available. Um, so I've done some slides because I felt like the easiest way for me to stay on track. And I want to start out by giving you guys a bunch of sort of general facts and information. Um, this is the stuff that's like, if there was a textbook about this subject, it would prioritize these things. And I think if you're doing this work, it's important stuff to know, it's important stuff to be exposed to, but it's not necessarily stuff that you would stumble upon. And it's definitely not necessarily stuff that's common knowledge. I mean, I find that um, it's a lot more familiar to people and medical providers and things like that than it was when I started doing this work, or when I even just started getting curious about this work. But it's still something that not enough people, even again, like OBs and midwives and doulas and stuff like that, they don't necessarily have all of this information as well. So it's good to know. Don't worry about taking notes on it. You'll have access to, I can give Rachel access to the slides so that you have those. And most of the information comes directly from some of the sources that I'll also share with you in a resource sheet at the end. So it's going to be a lot of stuff, but just bear with me. And I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through those things because my personal opinion is that those things are more boring. And the more interesting stuff is like, what does this work actually look like in practice? Like, what is the session like, or what are we doing in the room with clients? So I'm going to try this screen share business. See if I can pull this up. Okay, hold on one second. Oh, it says send request. I'm not very tech savvy, guys. Okay.
I just pushed allow, so it should be
Okay.
accessible.
It is not showing me my screen. Can you see it?
And I'll pull it up from my email as well in case.
Okay, so here we go. All right. And then Okay, hang on. It wants me to give you permission. I will give you permission.
It's very consenting.
Yes,
All
that's
the
great. I'm
consent.
happy to do that. I'm happy to give you
And are you
permission.
sure? Are you really sure you want to share this?
Okay. Da-da-da-da. Oh, okay. Hang on. Let's see if it lets me do it if I hit that. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, share. Should be able to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. We'll go into slideshow mode and we'll actually go to the start of the slideshow. Okay. Not a technology person. I'm
I
a
think that was
therapy
actually
person, not
incredibly
a technology person.
it's
Okay.
edited really well.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. So, yeah. So, like I said, the way that I've set this up is information heavy first. So we'll go straight into the information. So, uh, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders is the official term. You'll hear me and others refer to that as PMADs and also as perinatal mental health disorders. Um, Perinatal here is more accurate than postpartum because people frequently experience symptoms beginning in pregnancy and sometimes even prior to pregnancy when trying to conceive. Um, I mean, obviously you can see it also there. It says disorders. That's because this is not limited to depression. I think culturally, postpartum depression is the most familiar term for people. It's what people know the most about. It's Yeah, it's become sort of a more normal, in terms of language, part of the conversation in our culture. But the PMADs include all of these things. So depression, anxiety, panic disorder, OCD, PTSD, bipolar, with sort of extra emphasis on mania and psychosis. Um, Let me think if there's anything. I mean, I think that speaks for itself. I'll get over here. Okay, so again, don't freak out and try to write all this down. That's unnecessary. So the signs and symptoms are, I mean, honestly, most of these things are the kinds of signs and symptoms that exist outside of a perinatal context. So, like signs and symptoms of depression, signs and symptoms of PTSD, things like that. There's a lot of overlap. The things that I'll call out as sort of unique to the perinatal experience are mostly to do with, I guess I'd say they're mostly thematic. So it's like your particular anxiety stories and fears are more pregnancy theme, postpartum theme, parenthood theme. Same thing with depressive thoughts. Same thing with intrusive thoughts or compulsions. Those kinds of things. So it's like the tone of these things shifts to focus more on perinatal themes, but otherwise we're talking about a lot of very similar um, signs and symptoms. The other thing that's different is sort of diagnostically. The DSM uses, what do they call it, like a um, modifier or specifier. So they say, what is it? It's with peripartum onset. So you would apply that to depression, to anxiety, to OCD as a diagnosis. And for the DSM-5, that means occurring or beginning during birth within the first 4 weeks after delivery, which is not long enough. Uh, like everyone who's doing this agrees it needs to be much longer. There's a push for that to be 6 months, but technically for now it's 4 weeks. Um, and then I wanted to set aside this one about psychosis because I think it's probably the one that you have been exposed to the least, I guess is the way I would put that. So again, like you don't need to write these all down or anything, but these I think are good to sort of get stuck in the back of your brain somewhere so that if they start to show up, some part of your brain, like a little bell goes off. Wait a second. I think I've read about these things before. I think I've seen these things before. Could this be psychosis? I'm going to, I'm going to pay close attention to that, basically. I'm going to seek more support. And over here, this is the part I really wanted to call out. Immediate treatment for a person going through psychosis is imperative. So with the psychosis symptoms, and this is probably also true for like severe mania symptoms, we're not going to wait around and see what happens. We're not going to say like, okay, well, I'll see you next week. We're going to get that person connected with a higher level of care, which usually means emergency services if they're already experiencing psychosis, right away, because that's much more immediate concern. Okay, so risk factors, again, it's there's a lot of information here, but you'll have this later. And these risk factors, in many cases, are just risk factors that put people at higher risk for mental health conditions in general. You know, things like personal or family history, inadequate social support, financial stress, history of abuse, job loss, stuff like that. You know, those are probably things that you already know put anybody at a higher risk for mental health problems. And then we have, over here, we've got sort of demographic groups that chronically experience more mental health conditions. So queer and trans people, people of color, people with low socioeconomic status, people with disabilities, stuff like that. The ones that are specific to pregnancy, I don't think are particularly surprising. Maybe that's me, but things like if it's an unplanned pregnancy or an unwanted pregnancy, if you have complications during pregnancy, pregnancy loss, all of those kinds of things are risk factors. They're going to be more likely that you're going to struggle with perinatal and postpartum mood stuff. And then down here is specific risks for postpartum PTSD. And again, I don't think these are really all that surprising. Things like past sexual abuse or trauma. The ones that if you are just beginning your, set this up here. If you're just beginning your like work with this population, you may not be as familiar with the idea that birth can be traumatic for people. And that there can be, health crises like hemorrhage or things like that that occur pretty shortly after birth. And when those things take place, those tend to be traumatic and tend to increase the likelihood that you'll experience postpartum PTSD as well. Okay, so when should you refer a client to a higher level of care? This is sort of hard to quantify objectively. Maybe that's not surprising. Like a lot of the things that I'll say feel like they're kind of therapy does, and then they have like an extra layer to them that's perinatal specific or postpartum specific. So some things are really straightforward. If a client reports suicidal intent and or intent to harm their baby, then yes, like you're gonna get them extra help immediately. If a client reports or demonstrates psychosis symptoms, if a client reports or demonstrates clearly and significantly manic behavior. Like those things are, again, we're not waiting around to see what happens. That's when we're, I'll get into it in the next slide, sort of the more details about what that would be, but that's when we're responding as though it's an emergency. Beyond these things, though, it often comes down to a level of distress being reported by the client or the level of impairment to their functioning. So that includes, everything from like, are you able to prepare meals for yourself? Are you remembering to bathe, for themselves? But then also, how are you able to take care of baby? What's your responsiveness to their cues, their crying, their, signs that they're hungry, things like that. And then bonding with baby. And there isn't like, maybe there is, maybe there is somewhere, but in my experience, it's not like there's a definition on the page that says like you're bonding well, you're not bonding well. For me, it's a lot of like, what am I hearing you talk about? What am I observing? Especially because when clients continue therapy when they've just had a baby, as many of my clients do, they may miss 1 or 2 sessions, but then they usually continue pretty quickly after delivery. I oftentimes baby's right there with them, and I can see, kind of how are they looking at the baby? How are they responding when the baby, um, you know, cries a little bit or fusses a little bit, or, those kinds of things. And I would say the main thing here would be a sort of more flat affect, more disconnected. That's when I would worry about bonding, right? If they're just sort of like, yeah, or if the parent seems like annoyed with a very new baby for, kind of crying a little bit when they're talking to you or something like that. So those are the sign of bonding things that I would worry about. It makes it even more important that there's really strong rapport and trust in the therapeutic relationship, because so much of this comes down to client self-report. Um, Clients are often afraid to be honest about how much they're struggling with whatever they're struggling with in pregnancy or in postpartum. They can be really afraid of being judged. They can be really afraid that their baby will be taken away. So being really clear and honest as a therapist about like um, that suffering is normal, and what kinds of interventions exist, and the fact that none of these interventions, if they become necessary, would would be aimed at taking your baby away. Like, in fact, the opposite is true. That tends to help clients feel more comfortable and be more open and honest. Um, and then I'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide as well, but I find in perinatal work in particular, it's important to typically to have more collaboration with other contacts. So that could be healthcare providers, like if there's a prescriber, if there's the OB, things like that, but lactation consultants, whatever. But it also like a partner, if there's a partner involved, or if there's no partner involved, then who's the next closest social contact that is the kind of person that could be called on if it's an emergency, or can help look out for the client if it's not quite an emergency, but the level of concern is increasing a bit. Okay, so then when a higher level of care is necessary, I've sort of tried to group this into a more urgent situation versus a less urgent situation. So a more urgent situation means like you're in a session with a client, or they've contacted you because they're freaked out about what they're experiencing, and you've been able to get on the phone or on a call with them, and this is real time. And they are, reporting suicidal intent, or they are, um, you know, reporting or demonstrating psychosis, mania, those kinds of things. The the There's a lot of parallels to suicide intervention, risk management, safety planning, stuff like that here when it comes to, assessing the environment and figuring out like what immediate solution is going to work the best. So I'm not going to go into all of those right now, but just know if you've done those kind of trainings, copy and paste those kinds of things to this, because they work really well here as well, even if the client's not specifically suicidal. And then real-time strategies. So one example of this is, you're talking the parent through, or your client through, okay, set the baby down in a safe enclosure, walk into another room until you feel more regulated. If the acute symptoms are not passing, who can you call to come and tend to the baby and take you to the ER? If no one else is available, are you safe to drive yourself and baby to the ER? If they're experiencing psychosis, the answer is no. Like, we're not doing that. Um, and So if not, then I'm going to stay on this call with you, especially if it's a video call. You call 911, or if you need to hang up to call 911, you're going to call me back right after, or I'm going to call for you while we stay on the phone together. Um, Again, this is where that coordination with supportive social contacts is useful, because if you have been given permission and have access to contact the partner, you're going to do that when this is occurring. If not the partner, if it's, client's mom or sister or best friend or whatever, those kinds of things, you can do that. You can ask if the client has nobody else, can the client go see if there's a neighbor, right? And this is really just about like, we need to make sure that like mom and baby are both safe, or client and baby are both safe in this scenario. And oftentimes that is easier to accomplish if there's an extra set of hands that can come be a part of this situation. Um, so then down here at the bottom, 911 and the ER are better than nothing. What I mean by that is those services are not specifically designed or tailored for supporting pregnant and postpartum people. They can be really frightening. They can be additionally traumatizing. And yet, sometimes they're the only option, and they're better than nothing, right? It's much better to say, like, you've survived this, and we can continue to work to process the trauma that you experienced in this situation, then you may not survive this if we don't have an intervention for you. So, call them when you got to call them, basically. Okay, then, so for less urgent over here, it's a lot of overlap with this stuff, but a slower timeline. And so this kind of scenario is like you're working with a client and client self-identifies, or you together can identify that these symptoms are worsening. Or again, if you've got some coordination with partner or somebody like that, they're also identifying that symptoms seem to be worsening. So then this is a scenario where you have more time, you have more runway to have discussions with the client about like next level intervention options. So that would be something like the Center for Perinatal Bonding and Support, which is a partial hospitalization program. That's not the place that a client in acute psychosis is going to go, but a client who is experiencing intrusive thoughts and things like that, but isn't in crisis, would go there. And they also coordinate with emergency services as needed. So you're more likely to get buy-in and cooperation from a client to enter into a program like this if you, as the therapist, can, I don't know, like, give them a sense of what to expect there. So if you're not already familiar with these programs, it's a really good idea to get more familiar with them. Go peruse their websites. If you have time, you can give them a call and get your questions answered. I'm not as familiar with some of the other ones that are, again, they'll be on the resource sheet, but like the Center for Perinatal Bonding and Support, everybody is lovely. They all want to be helpful. They all have a lot of passion about the work that they're doing, and they want to make it accessible to people. So if you call and you're like, hey, I'm a therapist, I want to know more about this so I can tell any clients that might need it, if that happens at some point, they will be happy to answer your questions. Yeah, I think that's everything from that. And then this last section at the bottom here is maybe that's obvious. I don't know. I feel like in more general therapy context, a lot of therapists tend to concern themselves less with like what a client's, sort of client's child or children, unless sort of abuse, neglect are suspected, and then the mandatory reporter rules kick in. But in this work, it's really important to be thinking of the baby as your priority as well the whole way through, in part because the risks to baby if the parents symptoms are not well managed, and especially if the client does end up in crisis, those risks are real and they're significant. And that's whether in utero or after birth. Those are physiological and those are psychological. So we have to sort of be an advocate for the baby as well, particularly since, if your client is seeing you weekly or even more than weekly, potentially, you might be seeing them more than anybody else in their life. You might have more, and especially they're meeting with you virtually from home, you might have better insight into what their relationship with baby is really looking like, how baby's being tended to, sometimes even better than, if there's a partner, but partner's stressed and exhausted and working and all those things, you might have better insight than anybody else. So I want to stress, this doesn't mean overuse CPS. Just going to say that for my own peace of mind. It does mean being really honest and direct with clients about when you have concern about their baby's well-being. Um, Typically, in my experience, clients receive this really well because they want what's best for their baby too. It can be kind of scary and uncomfortable to bring it up with them, but generally speaking, I've had them respond well. Um, and don't be afraid to, if you need to call emergency services, to call CPS, to call these, collateral contacts that you have permission to contact, uh, to make sure that baby's safe, right? Like to make and keep that a priority as well. Okay. So then this next section, this is getting more into the part that is exciting for me, which is the stuff that I actually do. I don't know if maybe it would be good to just stop for a second and see if anybody has any pressing questions about the data dump that I just gave you. Anybody?
I think I've got a question. I don't know if this is a better question for later or for now.
Yeah,
Can you hear me, Kira?
I can. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Well, I guess what I'm really curious about from like kind of more of a diagnostic and
Sure.
symptom standpoint is when a client is really high functioning, and I feel like I find it's harder to tease apart some of the symptoms with the sleep deprivation.
Okay.
And I had a client who was very high functioning, and their baby did have like a sleep condition where they were getting next to no sleep for many months.
Yep.
And it just got really murky of
Yep.
like what's coming from that, what's coming from more like perinatal mental health stuff. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to kind of parsing some of those things out.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
like what is, because I think too when like you see a client long term before, and so you get to kind of know what their default mental health is like outside of the
Sure.
perinatal experience, like there's going to be like a dip and a change, but how to like know like, oh, this is like to a substantial place where we need like
Yeah.
additional intervention specifically for this.
Yeah. 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 I guess like one disclaimer I should add is that I don't really concern myself that much with diagnosis. I am not contracted with insurance. I think you guys are not mostly either. Yeah. So and I've never ever had insurance like refuse coverage or offer lower coverage because I didn't have a specific diagnosis of postpartum this or that. Usually everybody's just sitting there at adjustment disorder unspecified or whatever, because this is the biggest adjustment you can go through. Um, so I don't worry that much about like the specific diagnostic criteria. What I worry about more is like, well, what's the effect? Like, what's the impact that I'm looking at here? So to talk about your specific scenario, Erin, I might not really worry that much about like, well, would I call this postpartum depression or anxiety, or is this just extreme sleep deprivation? Because the effect is the same, right? I mean, from the sound of it, right? The effect is how is how is that inhibiting really important activities of daily living and other kinds of functioning? Is it inhibiting your ability to bond with your baby? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes that's the only thing you're doing and everything else is fallen away. But um, that's more my concern. And then, I can't remember if I said it already, but I will get into it. A big part of this is things like resource brokering. Again, I don't really do that much of that in the rest of my therapy work, but it comes up quite a bit more in this work. And that's for this sort of thing, that would be like, okay, if the baby has a sleep condition, what can we and can't we do to mitigate this problem? It also depends, of course, on like parent financial resources. If money is not a problem or an object to them, then we're getting you a sleep doula. Like we're going to connect you to a nighttime doula. If money is a problem, okay, well, we're going to work with you to get over the part of you that doesn't want to ask for and accept help so that you can ask your sister, your best friend, your cousin, literally anybody you want, your mother-in-law, I don't care, to help with this sleep thing if it's having that sort of impact for you. There's also the kind of thing where I would think more and talk with a client more about bringing in, if they have a partner who's co-parenting with them, bringing that partner in for a family session where we're talking about sort of education pieces so that the partner really understands, oh no, like if you're not already taking shifts, you're gonna need to do it, right? Like we're gonna need to find a way. And if you need to take some extra leave from work, we need to support you to do that. You know, again, resource broker around those kinds of things. So for me, much less about saying like this definitively is or isn't postpartum, whatever, and much more about the impact is what it is. What can we do about it? And let's try and connect you with those things. And some of it is about duration too. You know, if my client is exhausted in the first month, 2 months, yeah, yes, you will be, right? So there's a certain amount of um, normalizing it and then helping clients reset their expectations about what life could be in that time period. It sounds like your particular client is probably more than that. But you know, I consider that as part of this as well. Like, no, it's normal that you're too exhausted to get back to going to the gym or, you know, whatever, these kinds of things that you thought you might do at 2 months postpartum. So you're just going to need extra time to rest. How do we help you feel more comfortable tolerating that that's the case for you? So does that answer your question, Erin? Okay, great. Was there any other questions about this part? Can't see everybody. Okay, I'm going to go on because I don't think there are, but we can maybe come back to it if there are and there's time at the end. Oh, oops. Okay, so in practice, and this is kind of covering sort of what I was talking about to Erin's question as well, things are less cut and dry. So it's a lot, things are often less acute. I gave you all the scary stuff. That's kind of worst case scenario. But honestly, I don't see that very often. I think in the time that I've been practicing, the higher level of care has only been something that I've needed to coordinate for a client twice, maybe. And like a real emergency crisis situation that I think resulted in like a psych hold once. So it just, maybe that's me, maybe that's luck of the draw or something like that. But I think in reality, in practice, it's things are less acute and they're less clear. It's more like you're talking about, Erin, where it's sort of like, what am I looking at here? Is this just normal? Like you just had a baby and your hormones are going crazy and you're really tired thing, or what is this? And you know, sometimes that's like a duration, or oftentimes that's like a duration thing, as I was saying before. But in my experience, it's helpful to think of this as a spectrum in which all postpartum people are on it. And it's less a question of do you or don't you have these diagnoses, and more about to what extent are you experiencing these symptoms, and to what extent are they impacting your mood, activities, daily living, bonding, partnership, those kinds of things. Like I was saying about duration, how long is a factor, but it's more like for how long have you been experiencing this more acute level of symptoms rather than for how long have you been experiencing them at all. I would say that the things I see the most are like a depression-esque presentation, and that's most commonly irritability, anger, and even rage, and then anxiety. And those, I don't know what the statistics say, but those are the ones that I see the most. And then I guess the one important thing that I would add too is that it's not uncommon for there to be some level of intrusive thoughts with anxiety. They just tend to be less extreme than what's talked about with OCD. Yeah, I said already, higher level of care often isn't necessary. This is true for meds as well. Sometimes they are useful, but I would say more often than not, they don't come into play. If a client is already taking medication to help manage their mental health stuff, then it's going to be really important to make sure that they are working with at the bare minimum that their their OB or their midwife is informed about that, but for preference that they've been able to consult with, psychiatrist or psychiatric nurse practitioner or something that that does have specifically perinatal training or experience, because it's definitely not as simple as you're pregnant, so stop taking your meds, if they're already on something and it's working for them. So then this part down here is maybe one of the ones that stands out to me as sort of less well known, and that's that it's not uncommon for people to experience these sort of heightened depression or anxiety or things like that while they're trying to become pregnant. So before they even are pregnant. That's especially true if they already experience those kinds of things. If becoming pregnant or trying to become pregnant has not been straightforward or easy for them, and that could mean in terms of biology, in terms of money, their sense of social support or acceptance. So think about things like age bias in either direction, marital status or duration bias, the number of kids they already have, bias about that, gender identity bias, sexual orientation bias, like some of those things are I'm probably not surprising you by telling you that. And then also things like, does their partner have different ideas about them becoming pregnant, becoming parents, if there's a partner. Stories and belief about the timing of pregnancy also contribute to this. So that could be things like, I'm older than I wanted to be, or my other child or children aren't the ages that I always dreamed, they'd be in relation to each other. My friends have already done this or aren't doing this yet, or, things like that. And then the timing of trying to get pregnant coinciding with other life hardship, like being laid off or having a sick family member or loss or things like that. That is less well known, less talked about. So there's more stigma around it. So people are less likely to self-report that they're having those experiences. The exception to that is like if they're having fertility challenges, I think there's more understanding that that is hard and you should talk to somebody about it. But for all those other things that I said can contribute, it's good to be asking, especially if you have already been working with somebody, they have some of that stuff going on, because they very likely won't necessarily report their own sort of suffering around that. And then this last one, postpartum symptoms are not exclusively biologically driven. So maybe that's obvious at this point, given the risk factors that we saw, most of which are social, not biological. Excuse me. But what that means is that the non-pregnant, non-birthing partner can experience similar symptoms, and couples that become parents via surrogacy or adoption can also experience similar symptoms in the postpartum time period, that first year especially. And again, those people are much less likely to self-report that stigma and comparative suffering kind of thing. I didn't even have the baby. Why am I feeling bad? What's wrong with me? I don't get to complain, stuff like that. So if you are working with those people, or you're working with the birthing partner, and they're talking about that, then that's something to listen for as well. Okay. Techniques is a funny word. I don't think of them as techniques, but I really couldn't think of a better word, so that's what we're calling them. But again, some of these things are like therapy does, right? Like normalization, not making assumptions, validating, stuff like that. There's a way in which I think they are either extra important in perinatal support work, or they are, the way I mean them is a little different or something like that. So in terms of this one up here, educate yourself and educate your client, I find that having an understanding of like the norms, if you will, of pregnancy, postpartum, this early childhood development, stuff like that, and providing psychoed about those things to clients is a huge part of this work. Because very often not having that understanding of norms is fueling their negative self stories, anxiety, those kinds of things anyway. So if you don't already know a lot about pregnancy, et cetera, do your research, basically. It's, again, outside of the context of perinatal work, to me, I feel less pressure to like research what my clients are experiencing. I let them tell me. But this is different. This is really helpful to have. It's not like you need to be encyclopedic about it, but just to have a good idea about what's normal ranges for things. That could be stuff like pregnancy timeline, when certain scans happen, what kinds of physical challenges are common to pregnancy, having norms about the postpartum period. So like the level of fatigue and exhaustion that's typical, and chest feeding challenges are normal. And my favorite one is the common parenting pitfall: if it's 3 a.m. and the baby won't stop crying, now what? uh, Often instructing people to have like print out plan A, plan B, plan C and stick it to the nursery wall, because your brain doesn't work at 3 a.m. So, things like that, like things that are normal. And same thing goes for that first year of development for baby, first 2 really for baby, so that when, your client is saying like, oh, my baby's doing this or they're not doing this, you have that frame of reference that like, yeah, that sounds normal to me. That sounds like baby stuff. I don't think you need to be worried. I mean, by all means, check with your pediatrician if you want, but I think you're okay. The resource list that I'll give you access to afterwards has some websites and some books that are good sources for that stuff. It's not exhaustive, but they're ones that I like. So good places to start. And then I called this one out, grief is normal, because it is, excuse me, but it seems to be the one that people don't know is normal, maybe most of all. And every single person that I've ever worked with experiences some amount of grief in their pregnancy and postpartum period, which again is normal, but it's helpful to highlight that specifically. And then some things are normal but still dysfunctional, and that's like, Erin, I'm going to keep coming back to you because you gave me a really good example to work with here. Extreme fatigue. Okay, well, some amount of exhaustion, fatigue is going to be a part of the postpartum process, no matter what. And I guess unless you're a bazillionaire and you can hire somebody else to just like do the night shifts all the time or something. And even then, like if you delivered a baby, you're going to be tired. So that's normal, but it can easily get into a space of dysfunction based on the impact that it's having. And that sort of impact is what we're looking at to say, like, okay, is this dysfunctional to a level where we are wanting to pay more attention or wanting to come up with more specific interventions for that? The other one that I find is really common and really valuable to just be sort of listening for is sort of like a body dysmorphia around weight gain, around just body changes in general, and around chest feeding or feeling touched out, things like that. It's not again, it's normal. It's not automatically dysfunctional. It's just one that can pretty easily get into the space of dysfunction. Uh, excuse me. And it can inhibit, it can increase the feeding challenges. It can inhibit bonding. It can inhibit sort of connection in partnership or cause more conflict in partnership. So those are just things that I'm listening for, kind of what's the level of impact of these things. Have they gotten into that dysfunctional space where I want to help the client get more targeted resources for that? Okay, don't make assumptions. Duh. Again, it's like, that seems like such a therapy duh. I felt kind of silly writing it down, but I don't know. It feels like it is necessary to say around the pregnancy stuff because we have this culture that's still so shitty about treating the experiences of pregnancy, birth, postpartum as the nuanced things that they are, right? Our society, our culture, for the most part, talks about those experiences as entirely positive, and that's the message that's being presented. And we can absorb that a lot, I think, even as therapists. So, I've highlighted these things. It's helpful for a therapist to model that all kinds of thoughts and feelings are possible and normal. It's harmful for the therapist to reinforce the idea that certain thoughts and feelings are bad or wrong to have. Um, Again, maybe that's kind of common sense, but just extra emphasis on that in this particular work. I think common ones that can trip up even sort of the best therapists with the best intention would be clients having a sex preference for their baby. So, I want a boy or I want a girl or whatever. And then feeling anger or disappointment or grief that they're going to have a baby of a different sex than what their preference was. It's common for people to have a lot of stories and beliefs about the sex of their baby. And so then a lot of fears and anxieties go along with those stories. Other things would be complex feelings about, or even overtly negative ones about being pregnant in general. The reality of pregnancy can often bring up a lot of surprise, shock, and disappointment for people. Complex thoughts about chest feeding. Unfortunately, it's very common. Like, I cannot stress this enough. It's very common for healthcare providers to worsen this with too much emphasis on the idea that, breast is best. Probably one of the things that I've talked about the most with clients over the years is the research that's shown that when access to things like clean water, healthcare, and education are equal, any significant developmental differences between a baby who is chest fed and a baby who is formula fed disappear by the time those kids are 3. They are irrelevant. It's a different story if you don't have access to clean water, you don't have access to healthcare, those kinds of things. But I'm assuming that probably for most of the clients that you're working with, that's not the case. And again, there's such a prevalence for this message that breast is best. There is good research about like why chest feeding or breastfeeding is valuable. But if the experience of chest feeding is causing significant distress, then it's really important to help that client consider and sort of weigh whether the benefits of that recommendation really do outweigh the cost to them in terms of their mental health. Because obviously, mental health is also important for baby's development, mental health of the caregiver. But that's a big one. Yeah, I think that's probably, don't make assumptions, just don't do. Okay, and so then validate and gently challenge and reframe. Again, validation, we know you're supposed to do that. Carl Rogers, all that stuff. The difference here is I don't know what you guys do, so there's that. But I hear a lot of sort of what validation means to a lot of therapists is sort of this blind validation. It's like, oh yeah, of course, it's like that. It's like what you're describing. And I find that that actually can be detrimental in this particular work. So, rather than only validating, it's important, I find, to be curious about, and I mostly am finding this in the context of like when clients are feeling activated or dysregulated by some part of their experience. So, what's being activated for them is a question. What story, what feelings, what self-story, things like that. And then if you are working with them, if you've been working with them before, this can often be a really valuable place to kind of bring it back to like, well, what are their attachment wounds that you know about, or what are other common self stories that that you know of that could be activated by this, that could be contributing to the problems that they're experiencing. If you don't know them very well, like if they're newly referred to you in this period, then you can validate their experience more generally by saying something like, yeah, absolutely, X can really activate our nervous systems, or yeah, Y can really feel overwhelming in the moment. But then this kind of validation lets you set up a sort of 1-2 punch where you validate and normalize, and then offer that psychoeducation that helps to challenge or reframe some of the way that they're framing things for themselves that's problematic. So that's a reframing that should come as sort of gentle, simple, clear. A common one would be something like, the parent is triggered by behavior from the child. And this can happen as early as like, I don't know, infancy, 3 months, something like that. It happens very, very early. So let's say that they're triggered by the fact that the child's showing a preference for the other parent. This activates the client's self-story, feeling, like I'm unlovable and my own baby doesn't even love me, for example. And then to move away from the discomfort, the shame, whatever of that self-story, the parent will assign meaning, blame, things like that to the baby's or child's behavior. So that could be feeling angry with the baby, like creating sort of a shaming story about the baby, like this baby is so high maintenance or whatever, stuff like that. And then it doesn't, yeah, how do I want to say it's like self-promoting, right? Like then you tell this story that this baby's like this, and then everything reinforces your idea that your baby's like this, and then you got a bad baby who's mean to you or whatever. So validating that could sound like it can feel really painful when your baby seems to prefer your partner all the time. It can feel like rejection. And then reframing to it's actually really normal, especially if baby gets to see the partner less often, like if that partner works or something like that. And babies commonly alternate with these kinds of preferences. I get the sense that your familiar fear of being unlovable is being activated here. You want to explore that more, right? Again, that's like, it never would go that clean cut and dry, but that's sort of the bare bones of what I mean by that gentle challenge. And down here, my unpopular opinion is that if you if you spend any time in the space of the like postpartum, perinatal, whatever, you will hear over and over again something along the lines of like, mothers know their baby best, or like, you're the parent, so you're the best person to decide XYZ for your child. My unpopular opinion is that that is unhelpful, because on the one hand, yeah, like these people who that they're the parent to this child, they're the primary caregiver to this child, they're seeing things the most. And at the end of the day, they have to decide what works for them as that child's parent in their own lives. But people are not given a handbook about how to do this stuff before they get pregnant and have babies. And very often, especially if you go up here and do your psychoeducation, other kinds of care providers may have a better sense of what's normal, a better sense of interventions, a better sense of some strategies that could be tried to help manage things than parents are going to have on their own. And again, so much of this attachment stuff gets triggered for people in parenting that can drive people's choices or reactions to things in parenting and parenthood. And it's really important to be able to say, hey, I think this is going on, and not just say, well, you know your baby best. I guess he is being mean to you. He does probably hate you. I guess you're right. Um, so that's my unpopular opinion, though. Most of the other care providers that I know would probably give me a lot of shit about that. You can too if you want, but there it is. Okay, and then this last one is use of measurement-based care. I do not do this like hardly ever. I'm not a numbers person. I don't really do this outside of perinatal care, but with all of my perinatal clients, I'm going to use the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale at least once, like at least on intake. Or if I've been working with them and they tell me, and I'm listening and there do seem to be symptoms, I'm going to use that EPDS at least once. The other ones are available. I don't really use the PHQ-9. The GAD-7 is great if I specifically want to know more about anxiety symptoms, because, excuse me, that's the part that the EPDS doesn't cover in as much. I think it has like 1 or 2 questions about anxiety symptoms. But all of these are in Simple Practice. If you haven't already seen them there, they're easy to access and easy to use. And the EPDS is one that is used more commonly nowadays by like OB offices and midwives and peripartum nurses and things like that. So there's a pretty good chance that a client will already have been exposed to this. But the last question on the EPDS does ask about self-harm. So again, this is a place where I try to, especially if it's a client that is new to therapy, as like if people are having perinatal symptoms, it may be the very first time in their lives that they're doing any kind of therapy, the first time that they've needed it. So if that's the case, or if I know that that's the case, then I put extra emphasis on sort of helping people understand that it's okay to answer honestly about thoughts of self-harm and things like that, that that won't mean that I'm automatically going to call CPS and have their baby taken away or have them hospitalized or things like that. And that if I know it's going on, we can work on it together to keep them and baby safe. So that's something that I sort of explain a little bit more before giving someone that, if I know that they are new to the therapy process and world. Okay, this is the fun part. This is the part that I like. So these are themes of the work as I've seen it. I sort of did a reflection on what am I seeing the most? What am I talking with clients about the most? What am I working on the most with people? So you can see them all here. And then I'll just go through a little bit more detail about what I mean, but you can refer to them there. So not feeling immediately bonded or in love with baby, that is often tied to like the common misconception that everybody does. Like as soon as you pop that baby out, you're madly in love. You feel the strongest connection, you'd flip over a car for them. Like that seems to be a social narrative that people are really bought into. So when people don't feel that way, it takes them longer to feel a sense of connection with their baby. They can get really freaked out by that. Same thing with the initial baby blues and mood swings. There's an initial period of time. I can't remember the specifics on what it is. It's within the first month postpartum, and maybe it's the first 2 weeks, I want to say, where mood swings are incredibly common. I mean, you think about the hormone shift from having a baby, no longer having a baby inside of you. That's an enormous toll on your body. Your hormones are going crazy. So the mood swings are normal, but again, it's something that I still find people may not know about, and they get really freaked out. They think like, uh-oh, I'm crying every day. That means that I have postpartum depression, or I'm going to have postpartum depression. And they're really freaked out by the idea of postpartum depression. They're like pretty sure that that's the worst thing ever. So this is another one where it comes up as a theme a lot, mostly due to misinformation. I talked about this before, but chest feeding difficulties is a huge theme of the work. That can mean all kinds of things, stories about body, probably especially true if the client has any history of eating disorder or disordered eating or, things like that. Um, there's just, I don't know, I probably don't need to tell you guys this, but there's just so much of that in our culture. Even if it's not at a level of diagnosis or a sort of the official like eating disorder categorization, just so common that I find this comes up a lot, like people struggling with this for body issues. But also, if chest feeding in and of itself is difficult, then there's a lot of stories about that. Like, my body's failing me. I'm going to permanently damage my baby if I can't give them breast milk because breast is best or whatever, things like that come up. Difficulty tolerating babies crying in distress. This is another one of those things that's super normal. Obviously, no one really loves hearing a baby crying, but there's sort of at the level of being a theme of the work, I find that this comes up a lot as like, well, what kinds of stories does it make you tell yourself that your baby's crying a lot? What does it activate in you? And there's a lot of things about sort of fears about like, well, this means I'm damaging my baby, or this means that like my bond with my baby isn't strong. This means that my baby won't have a good attachment with me when they grow up. I'm not responding quickly enough to them. That's harming them in some way. Um, Often comes back to the client's own attachment wounds, our feelings of neglect or invalidation. And perfectionism is a huge part of this, I've found as well, like sort of wanting to be perfect at all this parenting stuff and what they think that means. Okay, navigating relationships. So family of origin, pain points, and then in-law dynamics. Again, that's not gonna, blow anybody away with surprise. But it does come up a lot. It's like clients' relationship with their own family, their own parents. What are their expectations about how those family members will or won't be involved with baby or grandchild or whatever. But then also things like, can I set and hold boundaries? Do I struggle to accept the goodness my family offers because it's not perfect? So that's a big one. And that could be, their family of origin or in-laws, when we're talking about family there. And then this one is a little bit, I don't know, a little bit harder to put into words, but the theme of either being too open or too closed, too rigid or too, I guess I should just switch those, too chaotic or accommodating or too rigid with how you navigate or how they're navigating various relationships. And all, so that comes into things like the boundary setting and expectations, but it also shows up in sort of their own approaches to caring, the way that they judge themselves, the standards they're holding themselves to for parenting and caregiving to their baby, stuff like that. So that's a big one. And then over here is perhaps the biggest one of all, which is the theme of isolation / identity or role of motherhood. And I've put motherhood here, even though I've tried to keep my language pretty gender neutral the rest of the time, because I do find that this theme is maybe not exclusively, but much more relevant for parents, birthing parents especially, who identify as female and identify as mothers. So again, not exclusively, but I do find that that tends to be more the case. So these kinds of questions: who am I now? Who will I be when this process is done? All these things, loss of, let's move this over so I can actually read that. Either sense of self apart from motherhood, or like a real loss of access to other expressions of self. So like the things you used to do, things you used to spend your time on that really contributed to your sense of self may not be accessible in the the postpartum period or for quite a while, really. And do I value myself in this role? More body stories coming up here. Again, it's such a common thing for, not exclusively, but especially women in our society, or people who identify as women in our society, to have spent their whole lives having some amount of their self-worth and self-story tied up in what their body, like, if, sexiness, beauty, things like that, that when that changes dramatically in the process of, pregnancy and then this postpartum period, it can really screw with a person's sense of self. And then impact on career. Has this or will this set me back? Do I want to continue? Those things I think are probably more obvious. I think the big one in that is when people have decided that they don't want to stay home with baby, they want to go back to work, but they realize that it's not like you just go back to work, right? Now you always kind of have two roles occurring simultaneously. You always have the parent hat on alongside, and especially, again, not exclusively, but especially sort of the mother hat on alongside whatever other job you have. So there's a lot of like trying to strike a balance that's thematic in that. And then, do others value me in this role? Often that's about the partner. Not always, but oftentimes that's about the partner, and comes down to things like division of labor. That should say trends. And boundary setting, asking for and accepting assistance. If this is especially true if someone is sort of a stay-at-home parent role, there can be a lot of tension around this. Like, am I contributing? Like, is my contribution as a parent valuable? And what if I don't accomplish everything? What if I don't get the dishes done? What if I don't make a meal? What if I don't stay on top of the laundry? I'm not bringing in an income, so then maybe I'm not doing enough, because there's a lack of recognition that, raising a tiny human is actually plenty. It's like loads of work. So, those are, excuse me. Those are, no, it's not going to let me. There we go. Those are the key ones that I find. I'm sure there are others, but those are some big ones. Okay, and then I'm going to go straight to the last one, but then we can come back and talk more about these things, because again, I said this is the part that I like the best. And so that last section is nope, now it's doing its own thing. There we go. The trajectory of the work. So obviously, like all therapy stuff, this is unique to each client. But there are some familiar sort of types or categories of how things can go. So for some people, there's a more sort of more acute distress and symptoms initially. Typically, these are the people that have been referred to you by their their OB, maybe even the pediatrician, lactation consultant, somebody like that. And they'll receive, like 1 to 6 months of support, which would be like normalization, psychoeducation, some resource brokering, potentially. Then they self-identify as feeling sufficiently better, and they terminate the therapy there. And then for some people, the distress / symptoms may lessen and feel more manageable than it did at first. Again, with receiving the same kinds of support. But then they self-identify that continued therapy is needed in order to maintain this. And these are the people for whom the work often evolves into further exploration of attachment wounds, trauma, dynamics in the relationship with their mothers, usually, and dynamics in relationship with their partner, especially. In terms of attachment work and partner dynamics, the things that I see commonly are attachment styles amplify in this period of time, or these experiences for people, especially reactions to disconnection, and especially challenges that people may face with collaboration in a relationship. So that could mean difficulty with mutual reliance, accepting help, and relinquishing control. But it could also mean difficulty sort of stepping into one's responsibility, taking control and taking ownership of things. So the around relationship dynamics in particular, a thing that comes up a lot in my work is helping clients understand the concept of you need to partner in order to parent. That's not, people can be single parents. I was raised by a single parent. I have incredible admiration for them. So I don't mean it like that. But I mean, if you're in partnership with someone and there's sort of this illusion that you will have partnership, then we can't just talk about your struggles parenting. We're going to need to also talk about your struggles partnering, because they inform one another. Or yeah, partnership will inform your ability to parent well. So having a list of couples therapists, a referral list of couples therapists who understand the unique challenges of entering parenthood is really valuable. Not all couples therapists work that way or get that, and that can be unhelpful. That can kind of cause more problems. And then working relationally. I don't know if any of you guys have heard Doug Shirley talk about working relationally. If you haven't, you should. He's the best. But working relationally. So think in your individual work, thinking relationally about what you're hearing the client describe about their own partnership is also really important here. And then I guess the last thing that I'll say is that this deeper exploratory work is typically, it's not like here's a chapter where we deal with your PMADs symptoms and then you're good, and then we talk about your attachment wounds. It's more like we're talking about the experience of those PMAD symptoms, the postpartum experience, parenting, early parenting experience, the whole way through. And then the attachment stuff gets woven in, the trauma stuff pops up and gets woven in, relationship dynamic work gets woven in. And, very often, like a trying experience of parenthood can initiate a session or a conversation in session about an attachment wound or something like that. And then usually I let clients lead the way in terms of all of that. Like, they tell me what we're talking about. They'll tell me, are we talking about your baby cried all night and you're losing your damn mind? Or, what are we talking about? But I will also bring up sort of relevant aspects of the other sort of, again, that attachment work or other things when it feels useful to do so, and based on rapport with the client, if I think they'll be receptive to it. So I might say, like, hey, that really sounds like this self story that we know that you tell about never being good enough, whatever. Do you hear that too? Do you want to explore that more here? Those kinds of things. Yeah. So, and then I've got, at the end here, I've got these resources. You will get these, so you don't need to try and write them down, but I just wanted to tell you that they'll be arranged in order of sort of more information, then more referral and consultation resources. And then this is some extra education for, it would be fine for anybody, basically. Like, you could share these kinds of teaching resources with clients, but they're also good for you to do that sort of educate yourself to educate your client piece. So you'll have access to those. But let me go back to that part. And then, yeah, that's what I got. So if you guys have questions, if you want to talk more about the themes, floor is open. Probably talked longer about all that stuff than I meant to, but please let me know what you want to know more about or what thoughts you have.
Another thing I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, something that just like the more that I um work with pregnant women or clients who are mothers typically, the more that this theme around having a C-section comes up and that being like the worst thing in the world and such a
Oh, yeah,
disappointment, and they were trying to have like a natural birth.
yeah,
And I feel like, a lot of like the typical kind of grief and shame work, and just even psychoeducation about that, or like redefining like what is a successful birth, helps for some people. But I've noticed like some clients that get super fixated and stuck on that, where so I was just curious, like,
yeah.
um what you found to be helpful for like when that is something that gets so stuck. Because I find that like that can be like on par with the breastfeeding, the chest feeding
Yep.
shame, and sometimes like even bigger. Like,
Yep.
so I'm
Yep.
just curious to hear your thoughts too.
Just a quick clarification, if you can, is that, do you find that the fixation is after it's occurred, or more like I'm afraid that I will need to, they'll make me have a C-section. I'll have to have a C-section. Is it more one or the other?
Yeah, I feel like it's more the after, although one
Okay.
client just really comes to my mind where like clearly it was like connected to some deep trauma stuff of like they had to be perfect. And so like that was complicating things, but like it was both like they'd already had one, had a C-section, probably was going to have another with their upcoming. And we were kind of trying to prepare for that. And it felt like the worst thing in the world and still
Yeah.
mourning. And then the last one. And um, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for the ones that it has occurred and it does feel like they're stuck with that. Um, I would say kind of first line of things is that's not one that I try and reframe at all, really. I mean, if they're telling a story like this is my baby's screwed up, or like we won't bond now, I might offer some gentle reframing of that because that's just not what the research shows. But for the most part, I find that that's just like a really complicated grief. That's like I really had a dream and a fantasy of how this would go. I find that people who have more, they place more value on um, the process of pregnancy and delivery as like a rite of passage in womanhood or something like that, that it's has much more significance to them how that occurs. And if that's likely to be their only pregnancy, um, or if they're pregnant again, but they're hearing that they're probably gonna need that again, it can really feel like they've been robbed of the opportunity to do it in this way that feels more true to, I don't know, nature. I don't know, whatever, right? So again, there are lots of ways you could reframe that because again, the research suggests it's not a problem long term. Um, but there aren't that I don't usually spend that much time on that. Instead, I just make a lot of space for the grief processing around that. And then if it continues and is really a fixation, then I'm thinking about that as probably traumatic for them. And I can't remember, Erin, if you do EMDR. Do you do? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. So that's when I might suggest doing a more targeted, either yourself or referring out for it, a more targeted trauma therapy to address that, because they may not really be able to identify it themselves. But when it is that sticky, then I'm thinking about how is this living in your body in a way that you don't have words for, you can't really process it, so you can't heal through it, you can't move beyond it. Um, I guess the only other one, and this is a little bit more like when people are afraid that they're going to need a C-section, is this is a place where psychoeducation can help around uh, like there are actually the book you'll see in the resources, Emily Oster's What Expecting Better has some really great information about C-sections, and some of the things that like you can experience more complicated outcomes with a C-section. So uh, validating that that is a real possibility for people is an important piece of that. And then also helping to reframe the like, but it's not, most of the time people have C-sections and they're fine, right? That's what we see statistically. So yeah, does that answer your question? Is there more? Okay. Yeah. I just think it's so much about grief there. It's so much. And I don't, it's one of those things where like if you don't relate to that, that's fine. But like I try to just like allow that. Like, whoa, I this grief doesn't, I don't connect with it personally. Like it's not something that I think I would grieve the same way, or, something like that. But whoa, you're really feeling the depth of that grief. Okay, we're just going to make a ton of space for that. Other questions, comments? I keep doing that. Stop doing that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned was that postpartum is typically monitored or kind of looked at in the 4 months, or I think you said 4 months after
4 weeks.
4 weeks.
Is
Okay,
the
wow.
DSM category.
Yeah. So I'm just curious how when it's not treated, how are you seeing this 2 years down the road, 4 years down the road? Like, how is that coming up?
Yeah. I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I like the people that I'm seeing because I have a reputation for doing this work. And so it doesn't usually take that long for them to come to me. The way that I would encounter that would be if it's a second pregnancy or, beyond. And in the process of talking about trying to get pregnant or being pregnant or having, leading up to delivery of that next pregnancy, we uncover that they had these PMAD symptoms and experience in their previous pregnancy that was completely untreated. And with that, it increases the likelihood that they'll have PMAD symptoms again. But and for some people it may feel there may be sort of a PTSD that goes with that. Like I felt so alone. I felt so, I felt so scared. It felt so hard. Those kinds of things. But again, oftentimes I find that the way I work with that, or the way that works best to sort of navigate through that, is making a lot of space for grief. Like, oh, I'm realizing and I'm coming to terms with and maybe confronting for the first time that I did have postpartum depression, anxiety, whatever, that everybody missed. And my experience was really altered, often in a negative way or negative ways. Because of that, it was really painful for me. And there can be just this tidal wave of grief that comes when you get to acknowledge that with a safe somebody for the first time. So that's more the way in my work, in my experience, just because of, being sort of, it's like my brand, if you will. I really only encounter that when it's like a second pregnancy, and that's or a second, they're starting to have a conversation about trying to get pregnant again, and suddenly it's like activating something for them. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer that for you?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense why why you're not seeing some of that, but it's definitely helpful to know how it shows up in a second pregnancy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the most part, I would say you're going to see a lot of the same things. So if you sort of look back at the signs and symptoms and stuff like that, it's going to be a lot of the same things. It may just have this extra layer of what feels a little bit more like PTSD, because there's sort of this echo. There's this buildup or accumulation of having gone through that before, and how that's probably still sitting in a person's body when if they weren't supported through the experience in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. So likely as trauma.
Well, and I might chime in there too, because I actually feel like I've had a lot of clients in that scenario where they've come in and looking back on a pregnancy, they're recognizing, oh, that was outside the scope of what might have been possible. Like I just thought that was how having a baby was. I hate my life. I'm mad at the baby. My marriage is falling apart. Like, and I just thought that's normal part of having a baby. And then having that reframed as like, oh, that was actually postpartum depression, or I've had clients where it's like that was actually a postpartum psychosis, and you just felt like I've literally lost my shit. I've had a break. I'm going crazy, unrelated to the baby, and having to reframe that. I think there can be so much shame. I just see a lot of shame clients experience about kind of like you were saying earlier, Kira. I wish I enjoyed that more. Like I thought I was gonna like being a mom or a dad, having a baby, and I was miserable, and not having a framing of no one normalizing that, oh yeah, you're experiencing postpartum psychosis, you're experiencing depression. So having to reframe, looking back, and I agree, Kira, it's a lot of shame work and grief work at that point.
Yeah, I think especially if people aren't planning to have another child, there is this huge sense of like, the people who were tasked with caring for me missed this. And as a result, I missed any opportunity to have a more pleasant postpartum experience. and I can't get that back. So that that's not always the case. Sometimes people are planning, like they're saying, it's they're planning or they're in the second pregnancy and that's when it's coming up. But if they're not planning to get pregnant again, that can amplify the grief and a lot of anger, a lot of feeling dropped by their care providers, whoever
It's literally like why we're having this training today. It's because so we can keep being informed and not miss something that we could be normalizing or identifying.
Yep. Anybody else have questions or comments? I love these themes. I love this topic. I mean, maybe obviously that's why I'm doing it so much. But if you even just have, thoughts or things you've seen, I would be happy to hear about that because it's all interesting to me.
I
just had a quick comment, Karen. I'm sorry, Aura.
Sorry, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, Brian, go.
I want to thank you for talking about the study about children over 3, that there's no difference, like the idea of breast is best. It's just I'd had the unpopular opinion that because formula changed my life, I think changed the world and allowed parents to not be bound by the home, and I just see a lot of shame and inferiority issues with mothers feeling message from society that I'm just happy to know about this study.
Yes, please take it. Tell everyone. It came originally from a textbook that I read, like in one of my, I don't know, classes that I had to take pre-grad school. So I, have never been able to find the tiny little, you can find the research, but I've never been able to find the tiny little like snippet where it was so clearly explained again. Because I didn't save my textbooks. But if I do, I will send it to everyone that I know. I'll send it to Rachel and she'll send it to all of you guys because I just think it should be a bumper sticker. Like, I think it's such an important thing for people to know. The family that I worked with, that I supported with their newborn twins, was a gay couple. And, it was sort of one of these things where it's like, well, if you tell people that breast is best, that means that like anybody who doesn't have breast to feed their child with is worse, is bad, is like doing a disservice to their baby. Like, do we really want to send that message to people? I don't think we want to send that message to people. So yeah, I get really cranky about it. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to pronounce your name, but I know you were about to say.
No, it's okay. My name is Autumn, and I also wanted to just echo Brian and the appreciation for the presentation. It was very informative and really helped me see like the spectrum of things, which was really helpful. I just had a question if you had seen any themes of like impact in their intimacy and couples' intimacy and how that is interwoven. Just because I do have a client where it's changed a lot as they are trying, and I just don't want to like miss anything or questions that I want to be asking around their experiences, how they're feeling, and thoughts, and etc.
Yeah, absolutely. In all of the stages. So if we think about trying to conceive, pregnancy, and then postpartum, at all of those points, it's extremely common for there to be changes in thoughts and feelings about intimacy and then intimacy patterns in general. So, in sort of the current version of trying to conceive, sex is business. Like, it's the job we're doing, right? There's a schedule, it's timed, it's very sciencey, and that is stressful, that is not sexy, that can make people feel kind of gross about those experiences, even though they know they're for this purpose that they want and they care about. So, having complicated feelings about that or just shifting sort of patterns and experiences around intimacy in that trying to conceive phase is really common. If it's leading to a lot of conflict between them and their partner, that's when I would be sort of listening a little bit more, like what's happening there. sometimes you can help with some psychoeducation, just normalizing like, yeah, this is really tricky. And is there any way that you can, I don't know, like introduce a little bit more specialness or romance, even though you have to do it on a schedule and, you know, those kinds of things. Light a candle, you know, whatever. Like, can you add some playfulness or some love back to this, or, you know, things like that. But it may also be that as you're listening, it sounds like it's activating more than that. Like it's kind of the doorway into some other challenges, maybe around entering into parenthood together in the first place or in general. And that's when I'm thinking like, I wonder if couples support would be good for you here. That's when I might start asking those questions. People are typically pretty resistant to that, I have found, because by the time they are trying to conceive, they typically don't want anything to threaten their sense that that relationship can continue. Same thing when people are planning a wedding, right? They don't really want to, they're not already working in couples therapy. They're probably not going to start because they, you know, they would much rather sort of go, la, 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 we're fine. We're going to get pregnant and we're going to be fine. We'll get to the other side and we'll figure out our problems, because the alternative can feel like it's going to be, now our relationship is falling apart. So I guess we're not having a baby after all, which can be really scary for people. So, but still, it is something that I'll be listening to, like, how pervasive is this becoming in terms of their interactions? And that's when I'm going to listen for whether or not I want to encourage some more couples support. Does that help?
Yeah,
cover-
no, that's really helpful. Luckily this couple is already in couples therapy, so I see both.
Right. Oh, you're seeing both of them. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah. So yeah, then for you as a couples therapist, I would think about it more in terms of like, again, normalizing, like, yeah, it's weird. It is weird. And then making a lot of space for what are the different kinds of feelings that are coming up for people. Sometimes all that's really needed is just the opportunity to say those things out loud. Like, I feel like you're milking me for my semen, right? Like, or something like that. And sometimes it's, you know, some strategies around, well, how could you make it feel more caring, or how could you make it feel more collaborative, or that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there time for one more question, or is this a better like email question thing?
I have plenty of time, so I think we're
Okay.
at time technically, but you go, like I said, I
You
love
can
this
go ahead
stuff,
and stop the recording for the credit purposes, and then we can
Mhm.
continue.
Okay.